So Katie, how are you?
Great, thanks. How are you?
Yeah, I'm very good indeed. You had a good week?
It's been incredibly busy, but yes, been great. Thank you.
Fab. And what's made it busy?
Well, we've got a lot going on. I work for the Centre for Human Factors at the University of Hull, and we're essentially setting up a business within the university, a consultancy business, where we specialise in work-related stress. And we've just got lots of interest in what we're doing, unsurprisingly, and it's primarily on me to grow that. So there's a huge amount of work coming through. It's all very exciting. I'm very motivated to do it because I really enjoy it, but there's just so much to do. So I'm having to learn from myself about work-related stress at the moment.
Fab. So look, and this is why I wanted to catch up with you. This is why, since we first engaged on LinkedIn a number of months ago, I've just been watching and listening with interest. This whole issue around stress in the workplace. And I know a lot of the work that you do is particularly around bigger businesses, but certainly what I'm seeing is there's a lot of the same issues and a big overlap with some of the causes. But clearly there's a lot of people as well leaving their corporate roles and setting up their own business. So even those in corporate roles that are in some degree of stress need to understand what the causes and symptoms are, the coping strategies that they can apply. So just I guess for the benefit of the listeners, really, just share a little bit more about what the Centre for Human Factors is doing. Because you also run a business as well, and this is an interesting dynamic for me. So you're not just coming at this from a pure academic point of view, you're actually running the business so you understand from both sides.
Absolutely. So I mean, I've got a lot of experience of stress myself, so my name's Dr Katie Cunnah. So I've recently finished my PhD, and I juggled my PhD alongside running a small business and helping my husband run his business as well. And prior to my academic career, I've worked in psychology and academia for about 8 years now. I changed careers when I was 30, having worked in consulting and as a teacher and in recruitment. So I did many, many different things in my 20s, and I had some challenging but useful experiences that I'm really drawing on in my current work. Particularly, I would say working as a teacher. That's probably the most stressful job that I've had so far. But I will say that having run my own business and lived with a man who's running his own business for the last 7 years, I've got a very, very good insight into what stress is like for an entrepreneur. And I do think it's different to the approach certainly the approach we in the Centre for Human Factors would take with a large business is very different to the approach we'd take when working with a small business or entrepreneurs specifically. The focus is different, and the stresses, so the things that are causing stress, are different as well. So most of our work at the moment, we undertake occupational stress risk assessments with large corporate organisations, and we're doing that just in the UK at the moment, but we're building a partnership with the Health and Safety Executive as well to develop this work, develop an automated tool that will enable employers to do this work for themselves more readily. And our work involves helping those organisations to understand the causes of stress, the root causes of stress within their organisations. So a lot of organisations at the moment are really trying to tackle stress by applying what we would call bandage approaches. So things that help to deal with stress once it's come up. So it would be things like yoga classes and resilience training and mental health first aiders, all great stuff, but it's not the sum total of the story. The other aspect to it is the root causes, and the root causes tend to be around the work environment and what people are having to do in their day-to-day role. So we do the assessment of those causes, and the two have to go hand in hand. Now, I think it's likely later on in this talk, we will talk about some of those things that I've just mentioned, the yoga and the mindfulness, etc. And I think it's really important to highlight that. I'm not saying that those things are not worth doing. They're really important. And especially when we're thinking about SMEs and small business owners, I said the approach is different. Those would be some of the key aspects that I'd expand upon when working with those groups. But in a big organisation, looking at root causes is much more complex, because you're talking about systemic issues such as workload and the kind of control over how people do their work and autonomy. So does that make sense?
Yeah, there's a lot of kind of cultural issues and hierarchy and kind of issues that are in play, aren't there? Yeah,
absolutely.
So you know, one of the things, I think it was National Stress Awareness Week last week, I believe.
Yeah.
And you know, it's certainly one of the reasons I wanted to spend some time with you this afternoon is I really do think, and I worked in a corporate business that had 18,000 employees in the UK alone before I set up my own business, and I worked with many small businesses. I just think stress is a bigger issue than is understood to be. So why is it important to talk about and be aware of stress at a national level?
Well, the business case is pretty straightforward. So the World Health Organization themselves have called it the 21st century health epidemic. It really is the biggest challenge facing employers at the moment. And of course, as a small business owner, it's likely you are an employer. So it's important to think about productivity and sickness absence from a business perspective. And just to give you a bit of an idea of how big this problem is nationally, in the UK alone last year, 57% of lost working days were due to stress, depression and anxiety.
Wow.
57%. And that number's probably not accurate either, because I mean, we're doing a lot of work with blue light services. So the police, we're looking at working with fire and rescue at the moment as well. And in that sector, I mean, it's probably the case in most sectors really, but particularly in that sector, what we've been hearing is that a lot of people don't report stress as their reason for absence when they're calling in sick, because it's not okay somehow to admit that you're struggling. And so it'll be, I've got a bad back, or I've damaged something, I've hurt myself, I've got some physical ailment. And there's also the element of the sort of social illnesses, I suppose, the functional illnesses. So people might become physically unwell, but actually it's a manifestation of stress or depression. So that data, whilst it's accurate in the way that it's been collected, there are some limitations as to how accurate the data is in terms of what people are reporting.
Yeah, I think, you know, from my experience, and I've got a couple of clients at the moment that are dealing with issues, for want of a better phrase, is that I'm not sure people want to admit that stress is the issue, because they then get stigmatized as to, are they up for the job? You know, are they the right solution for me? Do I get rid? Do I support them? So there is a big stigma associated with it, and from an employee perspective, and I'm not sure employers know how to deal with it either.
No, so this is why I think talking about stress is one of the most important things to do, because if you don't recognize stress and the signs of stress early on, it doesn't go away. It just becomes a bigger and bigger problem, eventually leading to burnout, or leading, for a small business owner, probably to the point where they hate their business because they've become so stressed. They've got anxiety every time they think about it, every time they open their emails, and they reach the point where they're just burnt out and they can't continue. And especially when you're a small business owner, someone else can't necessarily walk in and carry it for you whilst you take time out.
Right.
Whereas when you're in a big organization, so I work at the university at the moment, in a university setting, if you can't be there to do your job, other people have to pick that up, but that can't always happen in a small business. So it's really important to recognize the signs really early, so that firstly, you can protect yourself and your organization. You can deal with those issues to nip them in the bud and get the intervention you need at that point. And you can recognize what maybe you could be doing to prevent that from escalating as well. So if you don't talk about stress and you don't make it okay for your employees to admit when they're starting to feel stressed, then you're leaving yourself wide open to much bigger problems further down the line. And even more so, and I would say even more of an issue, is the fact that stress is toxic. It has an impact on your behavior. It has an impact on your thoughts, your feelings. If we think about, there might be some listeners who've engaged with cognitive behavioral therapy before, and cognitive behavioral models. If you think about the thoughts, feelings and behaviors cycle, they're all impacted by one another. And if one person becomes stressed within an organization, everything that they do will be impacted by that stress, all of their behaviours, all of their thoughts and feelings, and it spreads. It has a ripple effect across others within the organisation. I mean, obviously that can then have a major impact on productivity, business performance, team relationships, how people work well together. It's just such an important issue that it just can't be ignored and swept under the carpet.
Absolutely. But do people understand what stress is? Because I think there's a lot of words, and you've talked there about burnout and anxiety and stress, and what actually is stress? Because I think because people don't understand it, maybe they get labelled incorrectly. So let's define what is stress.
Okay, so if we're looking at a specific definition of stress, then it's actually an involuntary physical or psychological response to a stressor. So stress itself is involuntary. You can't control whether it happens or not. And it's actually, stress is if we think about it from a physiological point of view, it's the fight or flight response. Yeah. So if I say fight or flight, do you know what I mean when I say that?
Yes, yeah.
Describe to me what the fight or flight response might feel like in your body.
Well, yeah, for me, I think it's, the flight bit is you just want to run for the hills. You want to get as far away from the issue as possible.
Yeah.
And just don't be witness to the issue. Whereas fight, you really want to just roll your sleeves up and go head on with it and get rid of it.
Absolutely. Ultimately, when you're in fight or flight, your brain has been hijacked. You're no longer able to think rationally, and you're thinking with your emotional brain, your brain. So you can't think logically, rationally, fairly when you're in fight or flight. Now, the interesting thing about fight or flight is it's a mechanism it's an evolutionary mechanism that many, many, many years ago was really crucial to our day-to-day existence and survival. Today, it's less likely that you're going to have your fight or flight triggered by a threat to your life. Maybe different in some professions. So I'm about to do a talk for police soon, and I think in policing, very different situation. They are dealing with threat to life on a moment-to-moment basis in their job. But in most people's day-to-day work, particularly those who are in office-based work, they're not going to be facing threat to life on a moment-to-moment basis. But modern-day stresses can cause the same stress response as the threat to life. So when you take a phone call that causes you to feel conflict or under pressure, or you get an email that makes you feel uncomfortable, it's the fight or flight response that has been triggered. It's that exact same physiological response to the threat to life. It's maybe not as strong, but sometimes it can be, depending on how stressed you are. And the other interesting thing about fight or flight is that the more frequently it's triggered, the easier it becomes for it to be triggered. And when it is triggered, it will be triggered more strongly, and it will take longer for it to come back down again. So if you kind of imagine a kind of line, a straight line of how you're functioning, and when you get stressed, you kind of go like this. And what you need to do when you get a bit stressed, when your stress levels have risen, is you need to bring them down, and you need to be back here, and you need to know how to cope with that. Because if you don't, and your stress levels don't come back down, the next stressor, the thing that causes you stress, comes along and it goes like this, and then like this, and it just gets worse, and it gets much more difficult to bring it down, and you have to do a lot more. And so essentially in burnout, when your stress levels are up here, bringing it down takes a lot of work to get it back to here. And this is why
it's important to talk about it, to deal with it head on, to understand it. And then you're not going through this, because then you get too far away from being able to resolve it, don't you?
Exactly. Precisely.
So what are the symptoms and causes of workplace stress?
So, I mean, symptoms are different for a lot of different people. So different people experience it in different ways. But the kind of symptoms that you or people watching might have experienced might include feelings of loss of motivation, so apathy, perhaps, headaches, any signs of anxiety or worry, stomach problems, decreased sex drive. It can impact your appetite, difficulties with concentrating. I mean, to be honest, the whole list of issues could be a number of health problems. But if you get any health problems when you're working in a very intense job or running a business and you're overworked, then the chances are the symptoms you've got are stress related, and the chances are you'll go to the GP and they'll say it's stress. Which can feel quite frustrating if you think, I've got IBS, or I've got stomach problems, or I've got aches and pains in my joints, it must be something to do with calcium levels or iron, or actually it's probably stress. So the causes are quite different to the symptoms. So when we're thinking about the symptoms, you're thinking about the impact on your body, your feelings, and your behaviours.
And are the symptoms the same for people that work in large businesses and people that run and work in small businesses? Are the symptoms the same?
I would say symptoms are about what we call in psychology individual differences. So they're different from one person to the next. It doesn't really matter what environment you're working in. What's more likely to impact the symptoms is your personality type.
Yes.
And how you internalize things, how you deal with things, whether you externalize problems, whether you feel okay on a personality level, not a rational level, accepting that there's an emotional difficulty, or if your natural response to stress is to actually sort of manifest that in a psychosomatic type problem. And that kind of stuff is actually sometimes beyond our control because it's personality based. But self-awareness and self-reflection can really help with a lot of that, and recognizing what stress looks like for you. Which it brings me on to talking a little bit about mindfulness, actually. I was going to save that bit for later, but mindfulness is something that I'll come to again and again, and I'm sure people have engaged with it before because it's the big buzz phrase at the moment. But it's certainly not a solution to stress, but it is a really useful tool. And the reason I say that now is because I've just talked about self-awareness, and mindfulness is really helpful for developing self-awareness, listening to your own body and working out if you're somebody who struggles to talk about emotions or even label what emotions you're actually feeling or decipher what they are. I'm somebody who's engaged with lots of psychology in the past, and therefore I find it quite easy to know what I'm thinking and what I'm feeling at any moment. Not everybody understands their own emotions or has that space to reflect and label them. And being able to do that is quite crucial to being able to take appropriate action to look after yourself. And mindfulness is a really helpful tool for being able to do that. Now, it's far too much to go into talking about what mindfulness is and how it works today. We don't have the scope for that. But I would really recommend everybody watching really does read a little bit about mindfulness. John Kabat-Zinn was sort of the father of mindfulness. It's what's evolved to, it basically is rooted in Buddhist traditions. It's a type of meditation, but it's become quite a secular, acceptable form of meditation. And there's multiple different ways of using mindfulness, but it's really helpful to look at how it could be of use for self-awareness and for managing the mind, because in doing both of those things, you can start to self-regulate. And I think that's probably one of the most important things you can do for managing stress. Okay,
so what we're saying is the symptoms are very, very similar, regardless of the working environment, big business, small business, running a business, but the causes are going to be different, I suspect.
I think so, yes.
So just talk us through the different causes from a big business, which is where your experience is, but from what your knowledge or your insight may well be from a small business.
I think the major difference in working in an organisation and being a small business owner is that when you're a business owner, you feel that it's all on you. You can't go to your manager and say, you need to take some of this workload off me.
Yeah.
The other major problem is that in a business, often you'll feel like you're reporting to others, so you have less autonomy in a sense because you're always accountable to somebody else. Whereas in a small business, you are completely in control of how you do things. Now, wisdom and literature, in fact, research literature shows that when people have very, very, very high workload, but also have high levels of control over how they undertake that workload, that protects them against stress. So in a sense, small business owners should be able to be protected against stress, because they have probably a very high workload, but they can pick and choose how they do it, how they tackle that workload. That's not really the reality for small business owners, because there's so much that's out of their control that impacts their success. Because when you're a small business owner, your environment is not, and the thing you have to control is not just about the environment you're working in, so your workplace. It's also about the macro environment, the economic changes, the political changes, your clients, your invoicing, whether or not people pay on time, your cash flow concerns, and so much there that you don't always have the ability to control. You can plan for it, you can get advice, you can try and manage it, but you can't control it. And so actually, when you're a business owner, one thing I've not mentioned there as well is staffing. You are reliant on other people, and as much as you try to manage them, you can't control what they do. And your performance is often evaluated on the basis of what others are doing for you. And if they let you down, it's incredibly frustrating. And I can talk from personal experience there. And I think that is one of the major reasons that for a small business owner, it's such intense stress. So there's this perception that you've got high workload but high control. Actually, you've got high workload and your control can sometimes just feel down here. So I mean, if I'm just thinking about small business owners, the kinds of things that cause stress for small business owners tends to be things like financial management. Cash flow is a major cause. Issues around staffing I mentioned as well. Uncertainty, so you can't know whether your pipeline is going to come to fruition. Anxiety over the level of responsibility you've got. I've really learned myself, probably the hard way, that having a business and having great ideas and being creative and being entrepreneurial is not the same thing as being able to cope with the pressures and responsibilities of being the person who's taking care of all of that. And that you can't just say, do you know what, I quit, like you can with a job. The responsibility is all on you, and that's really hard. And when you're juggling all of this, and especially if you're just starting up a business or you're in the early years of a business, you are trying to be a jack of so many trades. And often most of those trades are not your specialism. And you don't have the finance to bring in specialists. So you constantly feel like a fish out of water. And you're trying to spin so many plates, and it can just feel like it's running away from you.
Yeah, I mean, this is exactly why this topic is so important to me and this afternoon, because, you know, small business owners are just juggling every single plate. And then if you add on to that staff issues, lack of cash, getting paid last, doing everything but the job that you love, and then they lose the mojo and why am I doing this and should I go get a job? And yeah, absolutely, you can't just jack it all in. Yeah, you've got responsibilities. So, you know, a lot of issues in small businesses as to what's causing stress.
And I think that's very different to how it is in big organisations. You know, it's not to say that people in big organisations don't get every bit as stressed as small business owners, but I think the causes and the solutions are different.
So talk us through the causes in large businesses, just so we've got some perspective, please.
So in the work that we do, we go in and look at it from a theoretical perspective. So we follow the Health and Safety Executives Management Standards approach, and it's separated into several different domains. So the first domain is called demands, and that's essentially covering things like workload and environment. So it might be that you've got a high workload, it might be that you're working in a very cold environment or a very hot environment, or there's something unsafe, you're working at heights, those kinds of things. Those are all about demands. The next one is control. So that's about how much autonomy you have over whether you do things. So for example, somebody working in a call center might not be able to go to the toilet when they need to. They might not be able to take a break as and when they want to. They might not be able to even get their manager when they need to because they're on calls all the time. So control can be quite different. Whereas in academia, I have a lot of autonomy in my job and a lot of control, high workload, but high control. So I manage it and enjoy it because of that. The next one that is worth thinking about is relationships, which is actually, that domain is about bullying and harassment in the work environment. So about conflict as well. And then support, so peer support, management support. Do you have people around you who help you and facilitate you doing your job well? And does your manager provide you with appropriate levels of feedback? Clarity around your role. So are the expectations clear? Does it match your job description? Is there even a job description? If there is a job description, or you've been moved from one role to another, is it in line with the skills that you brought to the organisation, or have they put you into a job that you don't have the appropriate skills for? Are they putting the appropriate training in place to support you if you don't have the skills that are needed to meet the expectations placed upon you? And finally, change management. And that is probably one of the biggest ones. So what we've seen in the work we've done so far is that where people are most depressed or anxious within an organisation, it usually correlates with the threat of losing their job, because change is not being managed very effectively. So they might have high workload, they might be being bullied, but actually the really biggest challenge that we've seen in the organisations we've worked with so far has been around change management, and that the stress that brings. And in today's world, most businesses are in a constant state of change. So I think one of the conclusions we're coming to is that there needs to be more done around change management, appropriate levels of change management in businesses to protect the well-being of people whilst they're going through these changes.
Well, absolutely. And I think, that's, you mentioned earlier, 57% of lost days, a minimum of 57% of lost days in 2018 down to kind of stress and anxiety.
Yeah.
That is a huge, huge cost of, I've got a client that works in the school space, and she's got a piece of software that helps to manage staff absence better. Because when teachers are off, not only have you got a teacher that's potentially stressed or ill or anxious, but you've got then a supply cost, so you've got a double whammy.
Yeah. So
her tools all around stopping teachers being off in the first place and being able to predict it and then manage it better when they are off to reduce costs, and there's an impact, there's a consequence on the education of the children. Other than 57% of lost working days, what are the other consequences of stress in the workplace?
Well, I touched on it earlier, but I think that one of the biggest consequences is behaviour, the change in people's behaviours. So just imagine you're feeling really stressed because you've got so much to do, and your emails are pinging through and you're desperately trying to meet a deadline, and then you get a snotty email from somebody. Yeah. Your stress levels rise. And your response is going to be, unless you say, right, I'm stressed, I'm going to deal with that later, or let them know, I'm really sorry, I can't deal with this at the moment, I'll come back to you on Monday when I'm able to think clearly. The other alternative is what most people will do, and certainly I've seen this in workplaces I've been in, is to fire a snotty email back. So then two people are stressed, and they then do it again, and then you're both in a bad place, and then another email comes through about something much less threatening, but you take it as a threat because you're already feeling threatened, and so you then start being stressy about that as well. And so then that goes to another person who then becomes stressed because they get this snotty response. Unless all of these people have been practicing mindfulness and have really, really tolerant and resilient people, then people are going to be affected in that workplace. So you might have seen thinking it from the opposite way around is on a Friday afternoon when everybody's emailing each other saying, have a great weekend, that puts people in a good place. So everybody feeling good on a Friday afternoon. But try emailing an accountant around about the end of March and you'll understand what people who feel stressed can get like, because they're really overworked at that point, and any little request that they get is going to just run the risk of tipping them over the edge. So the consequences really, I start with that sort of toxic ripple effect. It changes your behaviour, it changes your mood and your thoughts. So you're then in a negative mindset because you're stressed, and you feel less able to cope with things that you might ordinarily have known how to do. So you might actually feel less capable purely because you're stressed about things that you ordinarily would definitely be able to tackle if you just had the headspace. So it affects your interactions with others, which has an impact on your relationships. And I think it can become a really vicious cycle. But one thing I've not talked about yet is the relationships outside of work. So one of the biggest impacts is on your family and personal relationships.
Yeah.
You're not going to be able to be as present and loving for them if you're stressed, and you're probably going to have a negative impact on them as well with your behaviours. And I think it really ultimately has a very negative impact on long-term health. Thinking about the consequences for a business, it's going to impact productivity, because you already mentioned earlier on that people can become quite demotivated when they become stressed and disengaged. And that has a real impact on productivity, creativity, innovation. So I don't really see anything good about experiencing stress. I don't think I see any positive element that comes out of allowing stress to grow and develop within your organisation.
And I think there's a big issue here that you've probably alluded to, but you've not mentioned as such, but presenteeism.
Absolutely, very good point.
People that are actually in the workplace but are not productive because they're just not in a place where they can be efficient and effective.
The sad thing is that they're often trying really, really hard to be productive, and they probably are being to a certain extent. Maybe they're firing things out really quickly and it seems like they're being super efficient. But if you go and have a chat with them, you can see that they're crumbling on the inside and it's not sustainable. So trying to strive for a workforce that realises that it's okay to say this workload's not manageable. I need to prioritise. This is what's realistic for me within this time frame, and it's realistic for me without increasing my stress levels unnecessarily. It's really important to mention, I think, that with this issue of acute stress that I talked about earlier, a little bit of stress is not a bad thing. I don't know if you ever drink coffee. Drink coffee?
About every hour.
Yeah, yeah, that's probably a bit too much, but I tend to limit myself to 1 or 2 a day. But the reason I'm mentioning coffee is that coffee actually causes a sort of small stress response in your body. It helps, it causes the release of cortisol, and that stress response is helpful, actually. It gears you up to do things and to be active and to be on it, you know, to get things done. And I always have to drink coffee if I've got a big report to write, because I find it really difficult to focus unless I've had some form of caffeine. So I used to drink a lot of Red Bull when I was an undergraduate student. But the problem with coffee is if it's raising your stress levels and then something comes in that is by nature stressful, it's going to make you more stressed. So it's important to do things like use coffee effectively, recognizing that a little bit of stress is a good thing. A little bit of stress helps with public speaking and helps with performance, but it's when that tips over the edge and it becomes uncomfortable or it becomes frequent or constant or chronic that you've really got a problem.
So there's a difference between stress that drives somebody to take an action because they've got a deadline or they've got to get out of the comfort zone. There's a difference between that stress and something where it becomes unproductive and falls off a cliff.
Definitely. And I mean, I get a real buzz out of working under pressure. So if I've got to turn a proposal around super fast, I'll enjoy doing it a lot more than if I've got 2 weeks to do it in.
Yeah.
So, and I'm feeling stressed while I'm doing it, but it's positive stress. It keeps me focused, it keeps me motivated, and it forces me to do a task that I would find quite laborious if I dragged it out, but I actually do it quickly and enjoy it if I'm under pressure. The important thing to do is to recognize that when you're working like that and you get that, for me, it's an experience of tension in the body, and I'll feel like very like, I can always, this is working like a dozen miles per hour and just really buzzing off what I'm doing, but that is a stress experience, and it's okay to do that as long as you let yourself come down from it in a healthy way. And a healthy way would be about, at the end of that working day, recognizing that you've been doing something that's raised your stress levels, and to do something that brings it down. So it might be going to the gym, going for a run, doing something, and I'm emphasizing this word healthy because there's a real difference between healthy and unhealthy coping skills. It's not about selecting a strategy like I've been really stressed today, I'm going to go to the pub and have a few glasses of wine. You know, doing that once in a while, fine, but if that becomes your mechanism for coping with stress, that's going to hinder your body's chances of recovery.
Different problem as well, isn't it?
Yeah. If you pick something that's constructive and helpful, for me, it's getting out into nature. I've had a really busy week this week, but in about 20 minutes time, I'm heading to the Lake District and I'm going to climb some hills with my dog and my husband. But the dog's the least stressful bit of the whole lot. And I think as well, exercise, anything that's outdoors, being in nature, these are just my personal things. It can be anything for any, I think really it's about getting your mind away from what you do in your day-to-day work, going completely off task and being in the state of flow, in that sort of mindful state of completely engaged in something that's not work. So it might be painting or running or gardening or playing chess or just something that gives your brain that break from your work and stops you from engaging with thoughts and feelings related to work. TV can kind of help, but I feel like TV is quite a passive thing, really. And I think you kind of, my view is when you just sit and watch TV all night, then you're probably burying your head in the sand a little bit, rather than giving yourself a chance to properly recover. So a little bit of TV. Sorry?
Moderation, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's about having some balance. But when you're feeling stressed, often the causes of that stress might be a huge amount of work and feeling like you don't have the time or space to take a break. And it's really important to emphasize that that is the point at which you probably need to take a break the most.
And so what are some of the strategies that can be adopted by employees or business owners to prevent stress in the first place or to relieve it when it starts?
So to prevent stress in the first place is a more challenging issue. And to prevent stress in the first place in an organisation, in a bigger organisation, you need to understand what it is about your organisation that might be causing that stress. Yeah. And that requires quite a complex scientific piece of work. That's the kind of work we do with our team, and we also work with the health and safety executive who undertake that kind of work. If you're interested in understanding more about that, then you can have a look at our website, which is No Stress, KNOW, stress.info. And I can talk more about that. But I think if you're thinking about trying to prevent stress from an individual point of view, so the things that you can do, your personal responsibility for coping with stress, it's things like looking after yourself. So it's self-care, really. The most important thing I would say is probably sleeping, making sure you're getting an adequate amount of sleep. There's a really great book by Matthew Walker called Why We Sleep. And it gives you an idea of the impact of not having a sufficient amount of sleep. Since I read that book, I've been making sure I get good quality sleep every single night, and I've been so much better. It has so many consequences if you're not getting appropriate sleep. Physiological, it changes your brain chemistry, and you can't fight against that. You can't, you once your body is having a physiological response, it goes beyond your ability to think your way out of it. Okay, so you've got to do the things that give your body and your brain a fighting chance of being in a good state for dealing with stress in the first place. Sleep being the most important thing with that. Second most important, I would say, is eating a healthy diet. Eating generally, I know as a business owner, just sometimes even eating anything. My husband will go to work in the morning and not eat till 5 p.m. sometimes because he's just been so busy. Yeah. That's really not good. I'm not a biologist, but I know that blood sugar levels are important in maintaining a healthy attitude and a healthy mind. And if you're not giving your body the fuel it needs to be able to function, and your brain, how can your brain do such complicated, demanding, emotionally charged work if you're not fueling it? So eating and sleeping. Really very basic things, but very important. And then exercise. It really, I mean, there's so many benefits of exercise, not least the fact that it just helps to get your blood moving and flush whatever cortisol has been pumping around your system during the day out. Just give your whole body a bit of a cleanse.
Absolutely. And we, we talked earlier about this kind of lack of understanding, and employees suffering from stress, and there's a stigma associated with that. Why is it important for leaders to understand stress and be able to provide an environment or resolve stress in the workplace? Why is it important for leaders to embrace this?
I think if you think back to what I was talking about with the ripple effect, that sort of toxic ripple effect, the person who's in charge of an organisation sets the culture for the rest of that organisation. And you've got to think about what kind of leader you want to be, and what kind of people you want working for you, and what you want them to be able to do for you. And if you're a leader who's not self-aware, who doesn't recognise the symptoms of stress in themselves, who doesn't understand what stress is all about, then your level of empathy for your employees is going to be quite low. And if you're not empathic, if you're not compassionate when somebody says to you, I'm struggling, that's going to have a very negative impact on the way that that person deals with stress, or whether they come to you in the future. So your ability to manage yourself, so deal with yourself first. A lady I've recently been working with uses the phrase fit your own mask first. And she's talking about that on an aeroplane when the masks come down and they say you've got to fit your own mask first. It's so important when it comes to mental health, because if you're not mentally well and feeling as strong as possible, and you also are not honest when you're struggling, and you don't recognize it in yourself, and you're not taking good care of yourself, you're not going to be able to recognize it in others, and you're probably not setting a very good example to others about what you want. So if you're, for example, the kind of boss who fires off emails at 10 p.m. and hasn't made your colleagues aware that when you do that, it's only because that's the time of day that suits you to work, and you don't expect a response at that time, then somebody who doesn't know you well and know what your expectations are could be extremely stressed by that. And if you're somebody who does expect people to be responding to you at 10 p.m, then you're perhaps not recognizing the need for your employees to take time out and have their own family time and downtime in order to be on their A game the next day.
Absolutely.
And I know from my own personal experience that if I get up and work in my job from 8 a.m. until 6 p.m, and then I come home and run my business, and I'm working from 7 p.m. until 12:30 on business admin, the next morning when I go to work and try and write a report, I can't do it. Everything I try to do is just not, I can't concentrate, it just doesn't work. So give yourself and your employees recovery time, so that when you are at work, if you're at work for 7.5 hours, make it 7.5 hours of productive time. Don't make it a 13-hour frustrating, stressful day followed by another 13-hour day where you get even less achieved because you're all stressed and you're not concentrating.
Katie, you shared a hell of a lot of fantastic insight for us. Is there anything you think we've not covered that's important for those either watching live or watching on replay?
I wouldn't say there's anything really important we've not covered. I'd just say that the takeaways, I think, are, because we've talked about so many things, if there were a few things that I would say are the most important salient points, I'd say it's important to recognise that stress does affect everybody. The only people who are not affected by stress ever are psychopaths. And that's because they don't have, their amygdala doesn't work properly. They can't, the part of their brain that is responsible for emotion and fear, it doesn't work. That circuitry is not there. So they don't experience stress. Every other thinking, feeling human does. There are some theories around something called the MRA gene, but I won't go into that. So there are some types who don't experience stress to the same degree. It doesn't have the same impact. But human beings experience stress because it's a survival mechanism, and we therefore all have it. Your body is working well if it experiences stress. What you need to do is to recognize it and to realize what steps you should take in your personal reaction and response to stress, what works for you to both prevent it and cope with it. It's worth thinking of strategies, because I think preventing it and coping with it are two different things, but interestingly, the same kinds of things can have the same impact. So if you do yoga, it will help to prevent stress, but it will also help to cope with stress. If you do mindfulness, it will prevent it and it will help you cope. Prioritize your well-being. You'll be no good to anybody if you're not prioritizing your own well-being. And in prioritizing your well-being, eat, sleep, exercise, meditate, and repeat.
Fab. Katie, you've been an absolute star. I've learnt a load. I'm sure those watching and those that will watch on replay have learned and will learn a hell of a lot. It's a massive issue that I see and hear, which is why I wanted to have you on this afternoon sharing this insight for us. So it just leaves me to say thank you so much. Have an amazing weekend with your dog and your husband in the Lake District. And thank you so much.
No problem. And if anyone wants to contact me, I'm on LinkedIn. It's Dr Katie Cunnah. Feel free to drop me a message and let me know that you've been watching. Well,
I'll put the link to your LinkedIn profile in the comments. And was it a link to nostress.info?
Yes, remembering that no stress is about what you know about stress. So KNOW.
Yeah, I've got that. So if I put those two links in as well, then people can connect with you.
That's brilliant. Super. Thank you
so much indeed. Take care. Bye. Thank you. Bye.